program is recommended for adults-only viewing. Certain scenes and language may offend. Mā ngā Pākeke anake tēnei hōtaka, ka pāpauri pia ki ētahi o ngā pikitia me ngā kōrero.
We are the last marae practising culture on this planet, and the marae will cease to function if we no longer have tangihanga. It is the pautoka of our identity.
In the death and funeral industry in New Zealand, we are doing things differently, and the Māori in our community have helped the Europeans in our community learn more about being comfortable about death and being around bodies and honouring them and laughing and crying together, and that's a really good thing.
Tangihanga, at its best, is the best of being Māori. It's the best of our cultural practice, it's the best of our Māori understanding of humanity and of the divine. It's a form of cultural genius, dealing with a very difficult time.
We're borrowing from what other cultures do and sort of picking and choosing the things that would be of continuing value and making it much more a community, family event.
My name is Alva Dyerson. I'm from Oho, south of Levin. I'm Ngāti Raukaua. I have 5 children, 9 grandchildren and 5 great-grandchildren. I'm an ex-smoker. I stopped smoking 10 years ago. I've always had respiratory problems. The one time I went to see my doctor, I was on a course of antibiotics and steroid. That it hadn't worked. I was still having problems breathing and a bit of pain. So I went back to the doctor and she said to me, "We'll send you into the hospital for an x-ray." It was a Thursday. And I went to work on the Friday morning and my GP rang me and said, "Alva, I have the results of the x-ray. I'd like you to come in and see me." They'd found a shadow on my lung. It was either an infection or it was cancer. From there onwards, it's all downhill. An appointment was made at the respiratory clinic to see a specialist. We were in the office with my husband and my son and my daughter-in-law, and 3 of the 4 tests had come back with cancer. He wouldn't confirm the diagnosis, so I just said, "Well, if it walks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, then it's got to be a duck, doesn't it?" And he actually smiled and said, "Yes." So that to me confirmed the diagnosis, which I knew all along anyway. So we had a meeting, a family meeting, and all my children came and the specialist confirmed the diagnosis of advanced lung cancer and said that it was terminal, incurable. And I asked for a prognosis, and at that time he gave me 12 months. I'm a realist. I decided I would organise my funeral and went through the list and crossed off what I didn't want and what I do want. And my sister thinks I'm morbid and shouldn't be thinking about it, but if I do it, then there's no arguments.
The process of death isn't as simple as someone's alive and someone dies, especially from a Christian perspective and from a Māori Christian perspective. It's a time of transition that starts when a person is nearing the end of their life and continues afterwards. Now, if I kōrero, we refer to people as they're listening to us, even though they've passed on. So we have this journey, more of a transition, rather than just flick the switch in a moment. Regardless of our practice, we know that this is a very tapu time, very sacred time, and that we need to be doing something. We need that ritual, that focus. We need to come together. These are very common features.
It's probably not something that I've put a huge amount of thought into.
I don't know why, but I've always thought I'd be buried.
I think I would like to be cremated.
So when I pass away, we'll have a traditional tangihana back on the marae in Rotorua, and then also I'll be buried in our whānau urupa.
I'm looking to cremation, and I know where the ashes will lie.
Going to be taken home onto my marae, having a full tangihana.
I'm not sure what I want to happen. I haven't given it a lot of thought.
I know where I want my final resting place to be, which is back home in Samoa. Whether I'm buried or cremated, I haven't decided yet.
Going to go through the whole process of pohiri, have all my whānau around me.
I guess I want a party, and that's about all I can think of, and a few songs I know I'd like played.
The service itself I haven't given any thought to.
Well, I would like to be cremated, and I'd like my ashes to go somewhere in Auckland Harbour, and yes, and perhaps put there by a boat or a helicopter.
You know, 10 years ago, you could assume most of our Māori families and Pacific Island families were burial. Now things are changing. Cremation, burial, you just don't know what people are wanting to do. So we need to ask that question up front on the phone, is mum or dad for burial or cremation? Sometimes it's, will you come and pick my loved one up, and we just want a cremation tomorrow. You know, just a cardboard box and straight to the crematorium. Some of our urban Māori who are born and raised in Auckland ask us for our help. How should we set the house up to receive mum or dad? Where should we have it? What do we need to do? Kai, all that sort of thing, which sort of goes beyond our professional capacity, but that's kei te pai because it's all about manaakitanga. And we'll generally send whoever's not busy at the time just to get some whakaahua ready, some raudo to put around the photos, and try and block off the kitchen area. So we keep that tapu part sacred, ne? And so we just assist our families in those ways. Or if we're going on to one of our local marae and they don't have kai kōrero, or there's no kaumātua available, you know, then we'll step in and help, where we need to with speaking on behalf of the family, you know, te kōrero, ahimene, waiata, all those sorts of things. A lot of the time, the Pākehā, they didn't even know it was legal to take your mum or your dad home to lay in state for a night or for a few hours. They said, oh, are we allowed to do that? I said, yes, you are. You're allowed to take your loved one home. Families who we have informed that you can do that have been most grateful, especially when it comes to dressing as well, being involved in that process and not being made to, you know, wait until we're ready for them to view. It's just about educating and helping. Funerals are changing now, the way in which we die and the way in which we prepare for death and the way in which we celebrate death is changing.
I hail from Ngāpuhi tribe, the Mahurihure, my sub-tribe. It's a Māori cultural traditional thing that you always take chupapaku, go back to where your cord was cut, so to speak. And it was always my brother that went and picked up the body to bring back home. From a child, I was subjected to that. And as I grew up, it got into my system that, okay, something that I would like to do as well. So when I left home, I started picking up bodies and doing the same type of thing. But I wanted to go further. I wanted to become a fully fledged film director. When I first started here some years ago, and my mention of cremation didn't go down too well with a lot of families. They were of the belief that Māoris don't cremate. And I talk about the days the Māoris used to cremate before the Europeans came to New Zealand. A lot of them were unaware of that. And my belief is that because we've gone through a number of generations where no Māoris were cremated, so it became a belief to Māori people, Māoris don't cremate. But give them that little bit of history, changes that. So now, yes, we do a lot more cremations here as opposed to burials.
For Te Aroha, the cremation would have been seen as not appropriate because it was a distraction and it didn't allow time to really know if the person had passed on. The tangihanga at the very time of death is an acknowledgement of the person in life and is still seen as alive at that point for the next 3 or 4 days up until the poroporaki. The length of tangihanga was more dependent on how long it took for people to arrive and the mana of the person who had passed on. I've heard lots of different tribal stories around this. Rangi Walker used to talk about how it became legislated, that it was a 3-day or 4-day under one of the health acts around the 1900s when we were right at the breaking point of a culture practically on the doorstep of extinction in terms of a cultural practice. So the tangihanga to survive had to evolve.
Embalming is not compulsory, but there are consequences if you don't embalm. When we embalm, all we're actually doing is delaying the decaying of the body, enough for the whānau to be able to pay their respects. It's one of the questions that we ask, how long are they going to hold on to the body? We can increase the chemicals so the body can last anything up to a couple of weeks. The instruments that you see here are through my own ingenuity to make things a lot easier and more practical. For example, this instrument extracts all the fluid in the cavity of the deceased. I've incorporated the water systems that you use in the flower gardens. I've added the 1100cc water blaster. It increases the strength of the water flow, which then increases the suction. The thing for me is the reaction of the family when they see the deceased after I finish with the embalming, and the comments that come through, their complexion, just the outlook. So it's quite inspiring for me. The majority of my clients are from the lower socio-economic families. And buying a casket, say for the likes of this one, they can pay $2,500, and you can hire that same casket for $600, just for presentation. For the service, we then cremate the deceased on a tray or in a liner. Go and have a look at some of the stones that are available. There we have. For me, the important thing is to try and help the family that are struggling. What are you guys looking at? My culture dictates to me that I can't turn anyone away.
Cost-wise, it's cheaper.
When there's someone in need, I'm always there to help them. I've even had families who still owes me that comes to ask for my services, and I do it. But there we are. This is a cultural difference.
The base there, you can have that base.
I guess cost will be a factor in my funeral plans, and I guess that's a real worry, is you don't want to burden your family with debt.
Hearing through the grapevine, it's a lot more expensive than maybe I was aware of.
Usually with tangi, the whānau hapu and iwi help with the financial costs.
This is the reason why, part of the reason why we go into the marae, because we know that koha comes in.
Cost is all relative to how grand a ceremony you're going to have or what you're doing.
In Samoan culture, the entire extended family come together and everyone pitches in to help with the cost of a funeral. So while it is important, I'm also comforted in knowing that my family don't have to shoulder that burden on their own.
It is an expense to take the tūpāpaku to our marae, and so often it's more affordable to take their loved ones home to lay in state for a couple of days or for the night before returning out of Auckland or before being buried or cremated in Auckland. At the end of the day, it all comes down to them and what they can afford. Ne? At a marae, we've got to fill that kitchen up with kai to be able to feed everyone. Well, at home, it's a little bit more relaxed, and at a home, when you go to pay your respects, yes, you take a koha like the marae, but a lot of the times you're able to rock up and bring kai, which will help them in their grieving. And so those are some of the sort of growing trends we're seeing at this time.
Come on down, Alva. We'll show you our casket room.
Yes. I do find comfort and peace organising this, going through it.
Here we have our range of caskets, Alva.
Some people think it's a good idea and go for it and do it all, and others think, oh my God, how morbid. But I'm thinking down the track, I've seen the course from diagnosis to death. I know what happens. You get to the stage where you're not lucid, so I don't want to wait. All my children understand what I want to happen when I go. I want to be cremated. Given I'm going to be cremated, I wouldn't select a solid wood casket at $3,000. I'd hate to spoil that wood.
Yes, yeah. When the time does come, we'll embalm and casket you. Your family will take you to the marae and live in, and you'll spend 2 nights there, and then they'll bring you back, and you'll spend a night at home before you come to our chapel here. So we'll have your service here in our chapel.
Yes.
And then following that, the crematorium is here, all part of our building, so cremation will take place after your service.
Okay, thank you, Paul.
Ka tautoko ngā mihi ki te whānau pane nā mātua no te honore ki te noho ki Wainganui a koutou, ki te kōrero me te mahara, me te katakata hoki mo te oranga o te whaia nei, a Melissa. Nā reira ka tū tātou, me whakapākea, I will start with a himene, and then we'll have karakia, and then we will pass it on.
We met on a movie, like all good film crew do. You know, I didn't really think our lives would end up together. It's funny how things like that happen. She's the sort of person that would sort of take the time out of the day to help and explain something to you if you didn't understand. She was really helpful. She sort of cared for everybody, no matter, if she had met you for the first time. She was just a lovely person.
How lucky we are as a hapu that Neil met such a beautiful woman and that he brought her here to stay amongst all of us. We are the lucky ones. It is our blessing to have her lay down on our papakainga.
Mel passed away on May the 7th, 2013. She's Ngāti Hene. Her grandfather's side's from Waikare. Her grandmother's side's from Mototau. She wanted to stay here if anything that happened to her, just to be closer to us, closer to the boys. We got here and I think by that stage most of Mel's good friends had arrived. And really every one of them just got stuck in and started organising everything just with regards to making sure that everything went well.
Yeah, let's just share the love, forget about all the raru, you know, put it aside, let it go. If someone like this wonderful warrior is lying here with us, well, is she really? Lying here with us and do what she did, then so can we.
A lot
of what actually gets said on the last night is everybody's outpouring of their best moments with that person. Yeah, so it was sad, funny, entertaining.
I must say, I've got to digress. I can't help it. Sorry, sis. Going off script. Sorry, sis. Neil, whānau, waka, manaia. She left behind more than just you. She left behind a legacy that she followed with the things that have been taught to her by your tupuna.
Tangihanga is what it means to be Māori. The really fundamental basis of being Māori is not only on display, it's being practiced, it's being understood. All that comes together in a tangihanga in a way you won't necessarily find in any other situation. The tangihanga can bring a whānau together, it reassures, it can strengthen a whānau, it allows for proper grieving, it allows for emotional, spiritual channeling, focusing, release. It does all these things. It is the best of our culture on display.
I think it just gives everybody an opportunity. I mean, to say you've got the 3 or the 4 days while they're laying inside the whare, just to be able to sort of come and see the family, especially if you knew them all really, really well. It just gives everybody an opportunity to be able to be there, share with the family at that stage. So, yeah, the decision for her to rest and reside back here is a good one for us. Summer here is going down to Okahu Bay and having a swim, especially our youngest boy, Waka. It's always, go for a swim and then visit Mum on the way back up. I know Melissa's mother, she's always taking fresh flowers in. But I think the more and more that we think about it, it's a good one for the boys, for me, for her mum, to, I suppose in a way, just not to forget.
We need some new lights, eh? Well, those ones still
Tangihana, we're able to have a good tangi, We're able to cry with our people openly. We're able to hear all the stories about our loved one who's passed away.
My greatest impression is that it's a far more protracted procedure.
Te tangihanga he wā, hei whakakotahi I te iwi, I te whānau. Ko tērā me te whakakotahitanga he me nui I taua wā. Tēnā pē here kia ki ngā tangihanga o te iwi Pākehā.
The entire community comes together to help out, to pitch in, to help mourn and farewell their loved ones.
I haven't been to a tangi, but I imagine, or I think it is probably perhaps less religious, more of a ceremony, but less religious than the traditional European type funeral.
There's a sense that it's deeper grieving, more space to grieve, it's longer, there's a more intimate connection with the person who's passed, and I think that's something that we as Pākehā New Zealanders kind of really need to look at in the way we grieve.
Te ihi, te tapu, te mana. Ko te iki kua tau mai ki runga ki a hau. Nō reira, nau mai e te motu, nau mai e te ao. Tēnā tātou katoa.
The tangihanga of Tātarangi Kahu was a great national watershed in some ways in terms of Pākehā understandings around tangihanga.
With State Highway 1 closed, it was public transport that carried the masses to watch their queen make her final journey.
Just seeing the motu there as one that week was phenomenal. I've never seen anything like it. Man, to see everybody together, to see State Highway 1 closed, to see the train lines shut down, to experience her body being taken by a river to our tupuna maunga o Taupiri. Seeing her two rugby league clubs stand on either side of the mountain as they carried her past them. All the different patches from all the different gangs throughout Aotearoa stood one that day. And for me, to see Māoridom in that capacity was the greatest thing ever. That's what tangihanga is, the unification of the people.
Tangihanga has heaps to offer. It's the one hui in the Māori world where all our tikanga come to the fore. Tangihanga brings in whakapapa connections. It brings in therapeutic aspects of how we grieve and how we try to heal or support that grieving. For example, it brings in humour. You wouldn't believe it, but it brings in humour, and that's therapy of its own right. Secondly, it allows our men and women to continue our rituals, our traditions, our tikanga, in a way that is right and appropriate and tika for that particular marae, for that particular iwi hapu. It also allows our language to be used in a way that is emotionally very deep, because that's where the depth of our language comes out. It allows the creativity of people to use whatever emotions come to the fore to portray it in practical form, either through language, through haka, through waiata, through karanga, and so forth and so on.
Tangihanga is probably about the only place now where the reo still has a sense of purpose. With our generation growing up away from home, the language has been confined, pushed and shrunk into the marae space to the tangihanga. When we were young, I had never heard of a tangihanga occurring anywhere else but at a marae. Because the marae was set up to cater, you had a community around that immediately could go straight into the kitchens, and the cost of burying our people was absorbed by the huge numbers that always turned up for any tangihanga. Didn't matter who it was, everyone turned up. Everyone in the local community and people from outside. School shut down, any weaving, any carving, all of that stopped. Everyone's focus was on the death and moving through that life crisis to get back to the living again. One day it might be your turn, so everyone's looking after everyone else. What's lost now is we aren't doing that anymore. So that all the families and all the resources they've got have dissipated to the four tides. I guess it's the quid pro quo that when you do pass away, it's very individual. And it's only your direct family that are doing the grieving. But meanwhile, there's a wider kin back here at this community saying, oh, we've heard Uncle such and such has passed away. Can you get hold of them? Are they going to come home? And this is the problem. Sometimes they want to come home. The children don't know how to bring them home because they've never grown up here. And there's a lot of fear around that. I mean, it's literally just a fear of the unknown. What we're missing is bringing the person back into a cultural space to recognise that they're part of a link of whakapapa going back hundreds of generations. The tangihanga as a practice is as old as us navigating the oceans of the Pacific. And so we've been in the Pacific for 3,500, 4,000 years. Do we, since World War II, start to think, well, we don't need it anymore? I suggest we need tangihanga now more than we've ever needed it.
I think all cultures, no matter whether they're Pākehā or Māori, have the same grieving and mourning because it comes to the emotion.
I suppose Pākehā funerals tend to be shorter.
A Pākehā funeral seems a bit colder to me.
In my experience, they tend to be a bit more formal.
I think that we are much more stunted when it comes to the grieving process, the bereavement process.
Pākehā have had a traditional approach to funerals, but at the same time I think it's changing, has become a lot more informal in our way of life.
It's not as culturally acceptable to talk about death and dying and grieving, which I think personally can impair the process.
But I think there's been this kind of medicalisation of death in the Pākehā world, and I think that's really altered the way we grieve. I wonder if it's to do with things like the bubonic plague and us having to perhaps have distance from the body, and if that somehow kind of seeped into the way we grieve.
Waikamete Cemetery is the largest cemetery in New Zealand and actually the second largest in the Southern Hemisphere. There's 3 generations of my family buried here. My own parents, my grandparents and my great-grandparents. And you can sort of really trace the changing way in which people have approached death and burial through the sort of layout of the cemetery, the trees that are chosen, the headstones and monuments that are used. So I think that there's been a lot more loosening up and people are much more relaxed and share far more about family life and the personality of the person that's being buried. I think that's been the big change. So I think it is a reaction to the services having become just rather sterile and not being personal enough. I mean, there's often a lot of laughter at services when I think back. You know, to laugh at a funeral would have been absolutely terrible. But there is much more expression of different feelings about the person, you know, laughter at anecdotes and grief and crying as well. It was really common that the body would be at home rather than consigned to the funeral director. There are many photographs that were taken, particularly of children, and a photograph of the dead person was called a mort. Amazing photographs of the dead person laid out, you know, looking like an angel with all the flowers around her and candles, just in the bedroom or in the living room in the home. Victorian mourning was extremely elaborate. For women, they were expected to go into mourning costume, which was very severe, black. I think that they were more expressive about their grief. I mean, they took photographs of themselves in postures of grief, standing in the cemetery, sort of looking down at the grave or actually with the dead person, and you were expected to show that you were grief-stricken about the loss of the person. The fact that you were in mourning was a public display. It was just much more part of daily life and out in the open. And then I think we did go through this period where it was sanitised and hidden away.
As we headed into the 20s and 30s, sanitation became incredibly important. People became aware of public health things, so there's quite a lot of concern about some of the practices not being hygienic. Along with that seemed to go this loss of all the mourning practices and a much more tidy cemetery, not such elaborate graves, not such elaborate funereal processes, and much more handing it over to the undertaker, so the family's role became greatly diminished.
This room's quite a special room because this is where people often come to visit their loved one. It's all very informal. My background's Irish Catholic, and I think that's what you did. In your front room, you had the person there, and everyone just came and just talked and laughed and cried, and that's what we've tried to make this room like, really. So it's a very nice space, you know, and I love that. Sometimes we're in our office and we can just hear the energy, you know, people are laughing and there's music playing. We've got a box of toys, so children will be doing things, and I think that's a lovely, natural way of being with someone and not being frightened that they're dead. We do very little embalming. What we do instead of embalming is we lower somebody's body temperature down, which halts any kind of deterioration that could happen in the same way that chemicals do in the embalming. If the family want the person to go home, we will keep ice packs around them. And we've had people at home for, 5 days, and we haven't had any concerns about them. I think traditionally the whole funeral industry has been quite patriarchal, and I think that's disempowered families. Give us your person and we will look after them and we'll take any worry away from you. Whereas our whole aim is to empower them to actually take control of the funeral, to do the things that they feel are right for them. One of the great things we've got in New Zealand is the Māori and Pacific Island way of caring for their dead. We have a lot more families choosing to go home. I think that's wonderful. There's a lot more grieving that can go on at home, and I think a lot more Pākehā New Zealanders have taken that on as something that it's okay to do, and whether that's because they've seen it happen in Māori households, or they've got children, grandchildren Māori, married into Māori whānau, that they, it's become something that's asked for more, and I think it's great. I think it's a really healthy thing to do.
Mum knew she was dying, and so it was fantastic to have the opportunity to say, well, how do you want to do this, Mum? It's your party and it's the last thing you're going to do. But she was very, at first, when she was unwell and she needed a few days in hospital, she was reluctant to come home because she would be a burden. We managed to sort of get around it by asking the doctors if she could have weekend leave. So they'll keep my bed if in case I'm too much work. So yeah, but we weren't going to take her back after weekend leave. So that was her out and our in.
Once we knew Mum wasn't well and was on the way out, we didn't have a discussion. It was just we knew she was coming home. She's got a lovely home. She loves her home.
All 56 of Mum's descendants saw her before she died. And she held court with them, instructions, and she was extremely organised. She died with us singing to her.
Everyone just did what they thought they would like to do for Mum, or what Mum would like. So we were very lucky. She was in her bed, and the kids and grandkids and great-grandkids all came in and just stayed with her. She still wasn't left alone.
No.
There was someone with her the whole time.
Yes. While the coffin was being decorated and all the church service was being organised, there was a constant flow of little people sitting on the bed with Grandma. Grand Mary, we called her, because her name was Mary. And then there was sort of vying for competition who could decorate Grand Mary lying in state in her bed with more flowers or things they've made, and bringing her gifts. And that coffin lid was spectacular. There was messages, there was artwork, there was poem, there were flowers, and kids, little babies had drawn their scribble on it. And
well, having Mum at home and being able to do all that, it was a real honour. It definitely helped with the grieving.
It's hard to put into words, really, but Mum, it's what Mum really wanted. So if you've got the opportunity to find out what the dying person really wants, it's, you know, it's the last thing you can do for somebody, is help them die in the way they'd like to. It's a pretty nice thing to be able to do.
In the past, as I understand it, the women would cut their hair and often, in much grief, would use the cuckoo mussel shells and they would slice themselves. So blood mingled with their tears, with their hupu. They showed their grief in that way. And by some of the early accounts, when you read them, that missionaries wrote, they talked about how barbaric that was. These women mutilating themselves in grief.
The therapy of the tangihanga, the warmth of the tangihanga, the reconnection of the tangihanga to people, to our spirit world, te ao wairua, the connections to tūpuna, the recalling of them to come back and to support you in this hour of need all this time. All these are a part of the tangihanga. You don't see it in any other hui, Māori hui, but you see it in the tangihanga. And then at the end, everyone gets together with the hākari. You know, you come out from that world of tapu through to the world of light, where you've got to carry on the best way you can, but never forget that a loved one has gone. And so, all in all, the tangihanga, to me anyway, even though it's sad in its application, it is the most significant and central hui of the Māori world. And you realise life is beautiful, but it has its challenges.
Taking that mourning time, taking that spirit, taking that presence with us over the following year, towards the hurapuatu, towards the unveiling, is a time to both make those connections with our whakapapa, so going to those places where we connect to. Also a form of closure for the whānau, a form of healing, a form of even reconciliation, it can be quite often.
The challenge in the past is the same as it is now. How do you engage the society so they feel they've moved on from the death? Tangi is to cry. Tangihanga, a mourning ceremony. In the past, they may have only been for a few days, they may have been for weeks. It's the beginning of a death process through till the eventual acknowledgement of the kin group that the flesh, the ere tangata, had returned back to Papa Tuanuku, and the bones, the koiwi, were laid to rest within her womb, within a cave, wrapped in fine mats and red ochre, or korowai, kakahu, and kokowai, the painted koiwi. And that period generally was around about 1 year. And from that time of the death until the time of the hāhunga, or the lifting of the koiwi to prepare and then ceremonially have them returned back into Papa Tuanuku, was a time where the kiremate, the whānau pane, the grieving family, were in grief. And when you get to the hāhunga, which today is represented by the unveiling, then that is that time where those people are moving out of tapu back into everyday living again.
Kawe mate happens all the time. When we travel to another tangi, we're actually taking our mate with us to be with the bereaved family of that marae. The marae, by its very purpose, is our place together. And not just for the people that are alive today, but as we take our ancestry with us, we're automatically performing a kawe mate. Or the taking of our loved ones. We do it in many different ways. So it's not just marae. It's when we go to a hui and we greet each other. We always make remarks that honour those that have gone before us. That's a foundation principle for Māori right throughout the country.
Tangianga is a process, rather than a life then death. The process for the tūpapaku, for the person who's died, they go on their spiritual journey. The whānau too are on a journey as well in terms of their grieving process. Sometimes it's entirely practical, the practicalities of life, the absence of that person in their lives could take some time to recover and can have a spiritual impact, certainly on a whānau over time.
I'd suggest that if our ancestors turned up today to a tangihanga, they'd immediately recognise what it is. It's continuity. With everything else that's changed so fast, so rapidly in the last 50 years, let alone the last 200 years, they would still recognise the mourning practice as being a tangihanga, an essential element, if not the essential cultural pillar of what makes us Māori. And it can only occur in a marae context. So if we lose our reo, if we lose our marae, and we lose our tangihanga, that brings those two together into a dynamic response for the living to get on with the living while letting the dead go back to the dead. If we lose that, what do we really have that sets us apart from anyone else? Not just in New Zealand, in the world. We are the last marae practicing culture on this planet. And the marae will cease to function if we no longer have tangihanga. That to me is what it is, the pautokamana of our identity. It's that one moment where tino rangatiratanga, life over death over life, really can occur.
In my culture, death is as natural as birth, and there's no morbidness around it, so it's a very natural conversation.
As far as I'm concerned, death is nothing to be scared of.
So yes, I feel quite comfortable with it, but I'm not sure that's the case for a majority of people.
Everyone should have opportunity to talk about death.
I've never been really comfortable discussing death at all, and funeral plans, no, I haven't done it. But it's something as I get older I do think about.
I'm thinking of all the logistics of taking me back to Kikopiri, and I thought, I think I'll just stay home. And then I told the children, and their view was, no, you're going back to the marae. And so I had to say, OK.
I asked Mum, tell me reasons why you wouldn't go to the marae. And she said, hassle. And that's not really for her to worry about. It's for us to worry about. So if she wants to go there, we'll make it happen. If she wants to stay here, we'll make it happen.
I've finished chemo. My oncologist was very pleased with the result of the chemo. It shrunk the tumour down. I asked her, does the prognosis change? And she actually said that it'll only give me a short time more than the original prognosis, which was 12 months. So I'm still planning to go to Kikopiri for a couple of days and then coming home here. And I've chosen to come home and be buried at the local cemetery because my family are all here. It just makes it easier for my mokos and my family if I'm here rather than at my family urupa.
We've done the talk, and this time for me is creating memories for my grandchildren and children. So we've organised Christmas all together and just to create memories.
Oh, let me see your pretty face here now. Oh my goodness. Shall we? Screen. We're creating as we're remembering. Whoa. Oh no, it's all you came out.
No dawn parade, no faded photos in faded frames, no women waving, all dressed in black. No tinted veils hang from their heads. There is no singing, no gentle hymn, no heads are bowing, no lights to dim, no people crying, but for one, no reassurance, no yet to come.